Gives us more time for questions and that kind of stuff too. Well, welcome everybody to the NextUp Solutions monthly webinar. Today we're going to talk about the inspect and adapt loops that are baked into Scrum. We'll start out with some quick introductions in case we haven't met before. This is me. There's way too much stuff on this slide, but I put it all in one place so that you can fit it quicker because it's not very important compared to everything else we're going to talk about. I've been an Agilist for a really long time as far as Agile goes in the US tech industry. Well over 10 years, actually, I think it's closer to 15 at this point. But at any rate, I started off my Agile journey as a product owner, building mapping tools and other geospatial type technologies, primarily for government agencies in the DC area. I did that for a long time, and then I became a Scrum Master for a while, and then I stepped into full-time Agile coaching for a bunch of years, ultimately becoming the director of the Agile Center of Excellence at one of the gigantic government-focused system integrators. And for most of that time, I also was pursuing becoming a Certified Scrum Trainer, which has by and large been my line of work for the last 4 or 5 years. I also sometimes still do get to do some coaching and things like that, but primarily these days I teach Scrum courses and those kind of things. And as for us as an organization, we are actually 2 entities under the same umbrella. We are Acceleration and we are NextUp Solutions. Acceleration is our software development practice, where what we do is build world-class, amazing software solutions for folks. Although we operate on sort of an interesting model. What we do is we hire college students, typically, as they are finishing up degrees in things like computer science and other fields. They then come to work for us part-time in between their classes, doing real software development and testing for real companies under the guidance of our expert mentors who teach them that craft and keep them from blowing anything up. The companies that hire us get amazing work done at great rates. The students get a salary while they're going to school, and they get amazing experience, which lets them go off to fantastic careers after they graduate. It ends up being kind of a win-win-win for everybody involved. And if you have any needs in that area, by all means, reach out. I would be happy to connect you to folks at Acceleration who will tell you all about it. As for NextUp Solutions, we are a certified Agile training provider, operating out of the DC area, but these days increasingly globally. We run all sorts of live taught, expert-led, fun and engaging games-based Agile certified classes, lots of Scrum Alliance courses, also Kanban University, IC Agile, sometimes some other things as well. And we are a full-service Agile coaching and collaboration practice. So that means our experts help new or existing Agile teams get better. We help whole organizations plan out or improve Agile transformations at scale. And then the third leg of that practice is we help people grow into Agile leaders rather than just bosses. And for those of you who've done this a little bit, I'm sure you are aware, the ability of leaders to embody an Agile mindset is often a limiting factor in terms of how much value we get out of Agile teams. So that's a very important part of what we do there. And if you have any needs in that area, again, by all means, reach out, whether it's coaching or training or anything else. We're here to assist you on your Agile journeys. All right, so that is us. Let's go ahead then and dive in to today's topic, which is inspect and adapt. Yes, how does inspect and adapt work in Scrum? That's what we're going to talk about today. Basically, the big difference between waterfall models in general and Agile models in general really does have to do with feedback. How often does it happen? And how central is it to the way that that process functions? Every waterfall framework I've ever been involved with personally does have some nod to process improvement built in, about products, about team level work, those kind of things. But the problem we tend to have in defined process control or waterfall type models is that that process improvement step usually comes at the end. Sometimes it also comes in between the stages of a waterfall model, whether there's 4 or 12 of them or whatever, but definitely at the end, if nowhere else. What does process improvement in waterfall tend to look like? Anybody? What do we do to get better for next time? Well, maybe we're not sure. We don't want
Sure,
to.
we don't want to say.
Go
I
ahead.
was thinking nothing, but I'm really not sure.
Well, it's about as useful as nothing, but we usually do go through the motions. So you're not that far off, Ashley, but thank you. Generally, in my experience, what happens is we get everybody together at the end of all of the work, and we have a super fun sounding meeting called something like a post-mortem, where we talk about all the things that went wrong throughout the life of that project. And then we document them. We call them lessons learned or whatever other euphemism we're going to make. And then what happens to the lessons learned? Well, not much. We print them out and we put them in a very nice binder. We put the binder on a very handsome shelf, and that's pretty much it. There's no step 3. The reason we don't tend to read them generally is because they're not much good to us. We have to move on to the next thing. We don't have time. And the generalizable learning that might translate to the next effort, that's not what tripped us up. Those weren't the lessons we had to learn. No, unfortunately, all the lessons that we really had to learn, all the hard lessons, those are generally specific to building whatever that thing was and delivering it into that environment. And now we're moving on to a new environment with some other product. Lessons don't really apply. So the problem we have with that is that it's great to capture feedback in the interest of improving in the future, but if you only do it at the end, it's not very useful. Even if we do it in between the steps of a waterfall model, well, so what? Those were lessons learned about requirements, and now we've moved on to development or whatever the next stage in our flow is. If we maybe go revisit them a year later when we're on to the next requirements, that's the most we could hope for in terms of utility. So feedback is often a problem in waterfall models because it comes too late. Plus, we're also often not inclined to pay attention to it in real time anyway, because change is seen as a failure of planning rather than a necessity. Agile models, on the other hand, are entirely predicated on these feedback loops, these inspect and adapt loops. So it's the same types of activities that we might be doing in a waterfall sense, but instead of doing them as a one-time serial phase-gated kind of process, we do them over and over and over and over in tiny loops. And because we're doing it over and over in tiny loops, every time we go through that loop, we can stop, think about what just happened, realize some lessons learned, and apply them immediately in the next loop instead of putting off that learning for a year or something like that. So that's really what makes every Agile framework Agile. It's that they're rooted in what we call empirical process control, which is a fancy way of saying we are continually transparent around what it is we're trying to do. We regularly inspect how well we do it, and then we make small adaptations to get better. So transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Those are the 3 pillars of empirical process control. Every Agile framework has one or more of these types of feedback loops built in. And the notion is we're going to use those feedback loops every time we do another iteration or whatever the framework is. How each framework uses inspect and adapt varies significantly from one to the other. In Kanban, for example, there are not rules about these kind of things. Kanban doesn't typically come with inspect and adapt loops. You have to figure it out. So a Kanban methodology or a Kanban way of thinking would tell us we should have inspect and adapt loops. Great. But how to set them up is going to be up to you. One of the things I really like about Scrum is it actually has 3 of these inspect and adapt loops baked right into the process very explicitly. So that's what we're going to look at today. As a quick refresher, let's remind ourselves a bit about some of the core mechanics of Scrum. We have 3 accountabilities in Scrum. We have a product owner whose job it is to represent all of the needs and wants related to the work of a particular product or team. It's their job to listen to stakeholders, listen to users, understand what would be the most valuable work for the team to do in terms of product development, and then express a vision for that product in a single place that we call a product backlog. So one person on a Scrum team charged with making sense of product vision in a way that's going to deliver value. So that's the first of our 3 accountabilities. Then we have developers, the people who are going to actually do the work. And this is typically not a lot of them, typically less than 9, we would say. So, excuse me, one product owner and typically less than 9 developers. They are a small cross-functional team, which means that the developers as a group have all the skills and abilities needed to go from an idea to whatever done means in a single sprint. Those two roles on a Scrum team are co-equal. They are mutually accountable for outcomes, but they have different authorities. The product owner owns the questions, what and why and when, what are we building? Why should we build those things? How do they result in value? What order should we build them in? Those are all product owner choices, what, why, and when. Developers, on the other hand, own all aspects of how the work will be done. So what methods, what techniques, what tools, which developer will do which part, which tasks have to be done to get those things done. All of that stuff is up to developers. So co-equal, but with different authorities. And then the third accountability or role on a Scrum team is that of Scrum Master, which, if you've not done Scrum before, might seem like a little bit of a weird job in that they are not necessarily a doer. They are not building slices of product every day. That's the developers. They're not telling developers what needs to be built. That's the product owner's job. They're not micromanaging everybody in 5-minute increments. Actually, no one needs that job. So instead, the Scrum Master is a servant leader looking out for the health and well-being of all of these folks, excuse me, as individuals and as a collective. And more importantly, they are a team level coach, which means it's their job to think about how can I help this team be the best possible Scrum team they can be, and how can I help the organization surrounding the team be a place that's great at nurturing Scrum teams. So those are the 3 accountabilities on the Scrum team, and they have different responsibilities and things like that. It also turns out that each of them is responsible for a different inspect and adapt loop in Scrum. So that's kind of handy, and we're going to talk about that. So that's the Scrum roles or accountabilities. And then the Scrum framework itself is really 5 activities that go on every sprint. Backlog refinement is where the product owner and developers have discussions about work that might happen in some future sprint to make sure that we understand it very well before the team agrees to start it in a sprint. They have the same understanding of what done means, all those kind of things. And backlog refinement goes on kind of all the time, whenever it makes sense to a particular team. Some teams do it as an official meeting halfway through a sprint. Other teams do it just as smaller conversations that they have a little bit every day. Any of those are fine. What really matters is that enough backlog refinement is happening and that it's effective. So that's backlog refinement. The sprint cycle itself starts with a sprint planning meeting, which is actually 3 different discussions. In the first discussion, the product owner and the developers negotiate an overall goal for the sprint. We call that the sprint goal, maybe unsurprisingly. Then they negotiate which backlog items will get done in the sprint. And then they negotiate amongst the developers which tasks will have to be done to finish all of those things. So those are the 3 conversations that happen in sprint planning. They happen in that order. We call them the why, the what, and the how. Everybody's involved in the first 2. The third one is mostly just among the developers. By the end of that meeting, they have a very clear idea of what it is they're trying to accomplish. Then they can start the work of the sprint, at which point every day the developers have a short discussion amongst themselves to self-organize and self-manage called the daily scrum. It's typically 15 minutes or less. And then at the end of the sprint, everyone comes back together to look at all the newly done stuff and figure out what works now that didn't work before we did this sprint. We call that meeting the sprint review. Finally, before we start the next sprint, we have what's called a retrospective, which is where all the people in a team come together and talk about how well are we doing the work? How good are we at being a team? What might we adapt in the coming sprints to get even better at being a team? So those are the 5 activities that happen in Scrum: backlog refinement, sprint planning, the daily scrums, the review, and the retro. And all of them have a very important part in the 3 loops that we're going to talk about today. Some of them matter more in each loop than others, basically, and that's what we'll take a look at. In terms of the 3 inspect and adapt loops themselves, here's what they are. And if you've ever seen this symbol, by the way, for Scrum and wondered what it meant, this line and these 2 loops that curve back on each other, it's actually a representation of the 3 loops. We have an overarching product direction. So that's one loop, the inspect and adapt loop around product. Then we have a loop around how are we doing at being a team? That's the larger loop there. And then every day we have a little loop around our plan for the current sprint. So if you've ever wondered what that graphic is that often appears in Scrum materials, it's kind of a visual representation of what the three loops are. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the product loop first, then we'll talk about the sprint loop, and then we'll talk about the team loop. So let's talk about the product loop. These are the activities where the product loop really happens. First off, we have backlog refinement. That is where the product owner is continually updating the future state of the product. Basically, the product backlog, all the work that the team might do in some kind of prioritized order. Another way of thinking about the product backlog is it's really the way we visualize the future state of the product. So we know maybe what the product is right now, but what's it going to be in the future? Well, if we look at the product backlog, that should tell us. At the start of every sprint, the first two conversations, the why and the what, where the team picks the sprint goal, and then the team decides which backlog items will get done in the sprint to meet that goal. We are committing to advancing the current state of the product by building those things and meeting that goal. Then the team goes off and does that work, and we're going to come back together during the sprint review to figure out what exactly happened, how did the product change. So here really is how that process works. So during the sprint planning, the product owner and the developers negotiate the sprint goal, which PBIs will be done in the sprint. Then the devs spend the sprint doing those backlog items. Then during the sprint review, we take a look at the newest product increment. And the product increment is all of the newly delivered capabilities that were built during the sprint, plus everything that already existed before that. So the product increment just expands a little bit. Every sprint, we add more to it. And then the completion of that cycle, step 4, is the product owner then updating the product backlog in more backlog refinement discussions based on what they saw in the sprint review, based on feedback from stakeholders. So that's how the product loop works, basically. It's orchestrated during backlog refinement, during the first parts of sprint planning, and during the review. Who do you think, in terms of how often that loop happens, it's really kind of every sprint. So backlog refinement is going on more or less whenever it makes sense to the team. We do sprint planning at the start of every sprint. That's typically total a 2 to 8 hour meeting, depending on how long our sprints are. And then the sprint review happens every sprint at the end of the sprint. And that's typically a 1 to 4 hour meeting, depending, again, on how long sprints are. So that's how the loop happens. That's how often we go through that loop. And then lastly, which of the 3 roles do you think would be most responsible for that loop? Anyone have a guess? Whose job is it to think about this loop every day?
The product owner.
Very good. Yes, exactly right. It's the product owner's job to think about this all day long. The other 2 roles, of course, play a part too. Backlog refinement doesn't happen in a vacuum. That's the product owner talking to developers. The Scrum Master is probably coaching all those interactions, but it's the product owner's responsibility more than anybody else to make sure that that loop is effective. So summing all of this up, in terms of the transparency and inspection and adaptation for the product loop, we make the product transparent in 2 places all the time. Its future state is always visible as the product backlog. Its current state is always visible as the most recent product increment. So those 2 things are always seeable. We can always show somebody what is the product right now, what works as of today, most recent product increment. Where's it going from here? It's the current product backlog. We inspect changes in the current state of the product at the sprint review. That's where everybody can find out what is the product now that it wasn't before. And then based on that, changes or adaptations get made in future backlog refinement discussions. So that is the first of the 3 loops, the product loop. Any questions about that one? All right. Well, then let's move on to the loop around our plan for the current sprint. This one mostly happens during the last part of sprint planning and then during the team's daily scrums that happen every day. Here's how it works. During the 3rd discussion of sprint planning, which is the how. Oops, I've got a question in the chat here. Oh, just someone saying they're good. All right. So during the 3rd discussion of sprint planning, that's mostly just among the developers. What they're going to do is, after the first 2 discussions of sprint planning, the why and the what, the team knows which backlog items are we going to try to get done. At which point the developers can move into the how discussion, where they're going to break those backlog items down into very small, concrete, finite tasks. Typically things that would take less than a day. In fact, most teams will have an even more strict rule than that, like things that would take less than half a day. So they work together to break all of those backlog items down into tasks. That's them figuring out the how stuff. During that discussion, the product owner should still be available. Scrum Master should still be available, because sometimes they're going to discover questions that make them go to renegotiate how many things will fit in the sprint or things like that. Or they discover a question about how to do a backlog item that no one ever thought to discuss during sprint, during backlog refinement prior to this or something like that. But mostly that discussion is just among the devs. By the time they're done with that last discussion of sprint planning, they should have a list of all of these tasks that they're going to need to do as a team to finish the backlog items that they're agreeing to do and meet the sprint goal. We call that list of stuff the sprint backlog. So we have the product backlog, which is stuff that's going to happen in the future. The sprint backlog is the visualization of this team's concrete plan to meet their goal this sprint. From here on out, the developers own that artifact. They own the sprint backlog, which means as they are doing the work, they're allowed to change their minds about tasks to realize, oh, we need to do this, that, and the other thing to finish this particular backlog item or whatever it is. And the way that happens is every day during their daily scrum meeting, which is typically a very short discussion, typically less than 15 minutes, they will inspect that artifact. Do these tasks still make sense? Did anybody need to change tasks? Do we need to adjust our approach to meet the sprint goal? All those kind of things. So that gets discussed every day during the daily scrum, at least, and often, more often than that, just throughout the day. Danielle, you got your hand up. What's up?
Hey, Matt, good to see you. I always love attending your webinars. Quick question. So you brought up a really good topic about it's basically acceptable to make the changes to the artifact. I noticed some Scrum Masters with their teams, they will either increase and or decrease story points at the same time. What's your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. Should we change estimates for work in the sprint after we start the sprint? And the short answer is, I don't really think it's worth doing. So the whole point of estimating is as a forward planning tool. We think this backlog item is small, we think this one is big, and together we can use our guesses about size, which include effort and complexity and risk, to, as a team, hopefully come up with a practical guess as to how many things we might get done in the next sprint's worth of time. Unfortunately, sometimes because we're always doing stuff for the first time, we start the sprint and realize that a particular backlog item is a lot harder than we thought it was. Or once in a while it goes the other way. Something ends up being easier than we think, but usually it's harder. There isn't really much point in changing the estimate at that point, because so what? We've already started the sprint, we've already committed. And the points at that point, or the t-shirt sizes or the complexity size, whatever estimating method we're using, don't really matter anymore. It's just a question of, do we as a team still think we can get all of these things done in the sprint? And if not, we should go quickly have a conversation with our product owner to make sure we all agree about, if we have to leave one of these things unfinished, what's the least bad thing to leave unfinished? usually when teams are trying to change estimates on the fly during the sprint, that's a signal that the organization that they're a part of is not really understanding what estimates are and how things like velocity work. And we're confusing output for outcomes. So, we want to make sure we get all the points we can or whatever it is. I am really only interested in estimates as a forward planning utility, something that helps us make guesses about the future. The counterpoint, the only kind of thing I would do is if we're in the middle of the sprint and we realize that one of our estimates is way wrong, there's really not much of a point in wasting time to re-estimate it now. But maybe during that sprint's retrospective, we should talk about how were we really wrong to see if there's something we could learn and apply to other backlog items that we haven't done yet.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much the only thing I would do.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. All right, great question, and nice to see you again as well, Danielle. I appreciate you being here. At any rate, so the devs can adjust that artifact as they need to. They're allowed to change tasks because all of that is how stuff. That's up to them. And they'll continue to do that throughout the remaining days of the sprint. Now, they're not changing the sprint goal. That was negotiated with the product owner at the start of the sprint. And they generally are not changing the backlog items in the sprint either. That was also negotiated with the product owner. But they own the tasking for those things. They're allowed to re-engineer that as they need to. So that's how the inspect and adapt loop around our plan for the sprint works. In terms of how often, well, really, the sprint planning meeting is at the start of each sprint, as I said earlier. And we're going to talk about it at least every day during the daily scrum, which is typically not more than 15 minutes. So that particular loop is going all the time, which is why it's the little one in that scrum graphic that I showed you earlier. Which of the three roles do you think would be most responsible for that one? This shouldn't be a hard question at this point.
Scrum Master.
Oh, good guess, Odona. But no, it's actually the developers. They own that one. It's theirs.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. But thanks for guessing. Yeah, because developers own all aspects of how the work will be done, they own the inspect and adapt loop around their plan for the sprint. All right, so that is our second loop there. So filling out our chart a little more here, if we look at transparency, we make our plan for the sprint transparent as the sprint backlog. That's what that artifact is. And remember, the sprint backlog includes the sprint goal, the backlog items, and then all of the tasks that the developers created. It gets inspected at least every day during the daily scrum, and then they make adaptations by changing their behavior in the remaining days of the sprint. So for example, adding or removing or updating tasks, changing their minds about which developer will do which part, all of that stuff. That's what I mean by adaptation. All right, so that is our second loop. Any questions about that one? All right. Well then, let's move on to the third loop. Our process of being a team. And this is one of the things that makes Scrum teams typically so quick at getting to a level of high performance, because this is baked right into the framework. We don't have to guess or make it up for ourselves. So this one is focused almost entirely in the retrospective conversations that a team has every sprint. So that's when this happens. And the way it works is during a retrospective, the Scrum Master, working as a facilitator and coach, solicits feedback from the team members, that includes the product owner and developers, about how are we doing at being a team? What is working well for us? What things could we make even better? What things would we want to make better? They might also ask questions like, have past adaptations been working for us? You know, whatever we tried coming out of the last sprint, did that seem to help us in this next one? Things like that. Once we've got that feedback, then we would organize it, talk about it, generate some insights, and decide, okay, as a team, what's one thing maybe we would want to make even better coming forward? What are some options for that? How might we do that? And then they would facilitate a consensus for the team to pick one of those choices to adapt our behavior as a team in future sprints. So really, almost as I said, the work of doing this particular loop happens during the retrospective, understanding that the adaptations themselves are going to be carried out by the team in future sprints. In terms of how often, every sprint during the retrospective, which happens at the end. And retros are typically, 1.5 to 3 hour type discussions, depending on the length of sprint. Probably not more than 3 hours if you were doing month-long sprints. But generally, the shorter the sprint, the shorter these meetings can be. In terms of who is most responsible for this one, whose job would you think it is to think about this all the time?
Scrum Master.
The Scrum Master.
Very good. Yeah, it is the Scrum Master. As a coach, as a facilitator, this is their core focus all the time. How can I help this team be an even better team? How can I make Scrum work for them and for our organization? So thinking about that team level loop all the time, that's what they do. So back to filling out this chart then. We make our process of being a team transparent by inspecting it, and that's really what retros are. It's hard to do one without the other. I can't just plug a dial in somebody's desk that says, are we good at Scrum? So we have to talk about it. That's really the only way to figure it out. And then based on what we learn in the retros, we adapt our behavior as a team in future sprints. Sometimes that also might mean some feedback for backlog refinement as well. I can imagine a team like that's building software decide, oh, we want to stand up a tool that would help us be better at software quality, some kind of dynamic code inspection tool or something like that. Well, the work of getting that tool stood up and running, that should really go in the backlog, the product backlog. But then once that tool is up and running, then we would use it to change our behavior as people. So most of the time, the adaptations that come out of retros don't end up in the product backlog, but once in a while they might. And that is that loop. Questions about that one? All right. So there we go. The 3 inspect and adapt loops baked into Scrum. I guess this talk went a little faster than I was expecting. Here we are at 12:30 and I've kind of run out of slides. So questions about any of that? Does it make sense now how the 3 loops work? All right, so let's do a little review. How often are we getting feedback on the product loop? How often does that happen for a Scrum team?
Is it every sprint review?
Yeah, absolutely. Every sprint review, we're getting that feedback. How often are we getting feedback about how well we're doing at being a team?
Every retrospective.
Yeah, very good. Again, every single sprint during the retro. How often are we getting feedback about our plan for the current sprint?
Sprint planning.
Starts in sprint planning, and then we inspect it how often?
Daily.
Yeah, daily. Every day during the daily Scrum. So that's, again, one of the reasons I like Scrum so much is because we're getting this feedback all the time, not more than once, not less often than once a sprint. And in the case of our plan for the sprint, basically every day, that's really, really, really frequent. It's one of the reasons I like Scrum. When people ask me sometimes, how do we pick how long sprints should be? Well, that's a good question. The Scrum Guide says they should be less than a month. That's a great rule. Don't make them longer than a month. But in general, what I would say is shorter is better. And a good rule of thumb is, what is the longest period of time we are comfortable having to throw out the work of a team? So for example, if we're doing 2-week sprints, we might get to the end of a 2-week sprint and take a look at the new bits of product that we built and realize, oh, that's not actually good. That's not what people wanted. That doesn't meet the need. Let's get rid of those things. Well, that means we only went in the wrong direction for a sprint's worth of time, which for that team was 2 weeks. So that's pretty good. I like that. That mitigates risk because we're chopping risk up into smaller pieces. And that means we get more freedom to experiment and try stuff because we can only go in the wrong direction for so long. Same thing for team improvements. If we try an adaptation based on a retrospective discussion to make some condition better and it doesn't work, cool, we throw it out, we try something else. We're not investing a huge amount of time and money in any particular change. They're all little experiments, which makes them safer, which gives us more freedom to try bold things. And by keeping what works and tossing what doesn't, that's how Scrum teams get to a level of high performance relatively quickly. So there you go. Those are the 3 inspect and adapt loops in Scrum. Every Agile framework does have various versions of these built in. Some are very explicit, like in Scrum. Others are more implicit, like in Kanban, where you have to figure out how you want them to work. But that's really what makes all of these methods Agile. All right, then. Well, I think that's probably the end of the material that I wanted to go through today. Anybody have any other questions that you want to talk about?